Good afternoon. This is Grant Swartzwelder, President of OTA Environmental Solutions, and welcome to the 50th episode of the Oilfield Strong webinar series. It's pretty amazing that we started this in the COVID time period, doing it weekly because of COVID, but then as things got more normal, we started doing it monthly, and we have continued to do it for several years now. The whole purpose is to have education and information for the oil field. Goes all directions. We've had folks on both sides of the issues, and I think that's what makes this conversation good. And this is such a perfect presentation for the 50th episode because it's I think will be very informative and very useful given what's happening over in New Mexico. I'm very fortunate to be able to introduce Dylan Fuge, who is now the director of OCD, the Oil Conservation Division. We had his predecessor on about 3 or 4 years ago, Adrienne Sandoval. I believe she was director of OCD. Is that so? And she's left now to go, I think, with the EPA, or I forget now.
EPA Region 8.
Fantastic. So it's so I think this is fantastic to kind of look about 3 or 4 years since then and kind of what's been, because obviously quite a few changes have been made there in New Mexico from rules, regulation, and enforcement. So with that, maybe I'll start at a nice, easy question, Mr. Fuge, and just kind of, what is it that you're focused on right now and the agency's focused on? I know that's a very general, but I'll let you kind of, and then we'll follow it up with some specific questions about flaring and data and things like that.
So, obviously we're in the start of the second term of the Governor Lujan Grisham administration, and are looking to build on the, progress of my predecessors, both rebuilding and a little bit of reshaping of the OCD so that we can ensure we're implementing our broad sort of statutory mission to protect prevent waste and protect correlative rights and all of our duties under the New Mexico Oil and Gas Act. In terms of how those priorities are playing out in kind of key areas of focus, we are obviously looking at implementation of the waste rule. From my perspective, the sort of rule development, rule establishment is in a very, very, very important milestone, but the rubber really meets the road in implementation, and we're now in sort of a key implementation phase of the rule. So that's one, key area of focus. Another, obviously, with the significant increases in production that we've seen in New Mexico, and particularly in our part of the Permian Basin, how we manage produced water, how we manage for seismicity, other things like that are obviously an area of continued focus, and an area of focus that I know, New Mexico shares, with the state of Texas. We've taken some different approaches to it, but obviously it's a shared basin and shared challenges, with the management of produced water. And then, looking ahead and looking forward, obviously, there's significant interest in New Mexico and particularly the OCD establishing primacy, Class 6 primacy, and taking steps towards, being able to authorize kind of carbon management activities, whether they're related to oil and gas or otherwise. And then sort of as time and sort of focus allows, continued kind of modernization of rules that are a little outdated. Some of them kind of hyper technical. How do we do process? Do you need to do certified mail for service, which seems boring and trivial, but it's its own complication and potentially kind of unnecessary. But looking at the rules kind of across the boards, are there areas that we need to update? Are there areas that we need to modernize? And that's just in addition to keeping pace with the existing and increasing volume of work we're getting associated with the increased development. So I would say those are the kind of key areas of focus at like a 10,000 foot level.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. I appreciate the overview. I might go backwards because you brought up that modernization. And that's something that always intrigues me because we've worked with Railroad Commission, we see it with New Mexico. There's so much data that's being asked for, is that flare working? How much are you flaring? Things like that, permitting. And it's just wonder if the various states and the EPA are able to handle that type of data, that amount of data, and be able to do something with that. It's go ahead.
So
I'm sorry.
I think the data is a lot. I think the data, though, is key to us doing our jobs effectively,
Oh, sure.
and building, kind of public trust in sort of the processes and information, because it allows us to put, a level of transparency on operations and other pieces. I do think we have reached a phase where, despite the challenges associated with, state procurement processes and the like, that state agencies need to make investments in technological solutions. So solutions to help do some preliminary data analysis, digestion, trend spotting, other things like that. There are commercially available tools, obviously, by large tech companies that do some of that I think well, there are going to be investments that the OCD is looking at making over the next sort of fiscal year, because I think it's critical to us to sort of ease the burden on my technical staff, not to make the nuanced decisions about where problems are, where they occur, but to take the burden off my staff of doing some of the more straightforward and simpler kind of preliminary analytics on the volume of data that's coming in, whether it's comparing flaring reports for an operator and seeing if there are anomalous trends. Do volumes drop off dramatically? Oftentimes there's a good explanation for that, but are there trends that we should be looking at in areas and sort of other pieces? Right now, we're doing that a little bit more manually than I would like. And so I think we're looking at opportunities there, because that type of modernization is going to be key. It also allows us to be more, I think, quickly responsive to issues that are observed in the field, if you don't have to do all of that, kind of pre-processing work in-house. At least on the OCD side, we attempt to be very thoughtful in the data we're collecting, and then try to be very transparent with the data that we have. So the public can go to our website. If they've got questions of flaring and other pieces, they can pull down reports by operator, by region, other things like that, if they really want to dig into it on almost a real-time basis. There's a slight lag for posting and updating, but that's measured in hours.
Yeah, I think the whole visualization of the performance, I think, helps everyone understand what the situation is. So that's go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, and I would add too, with the visualization, I think we're going to see even more third-party data sets and data coming in, whether it's the Environmental Defense Fund's methane sat system with launching, or their flyovers that are currently underway, or EPA's flyovers, or NASA's EMIT system. I'm now getting pretty regular queries about, hey, we noticed this plume in this system. What happened? What are you seeing? We're able to track them down, for the most part. And, frequently we have an answer, but I'd like it to be a little faster and with a little less work, as we start getting those inquiries from third parties and have different sets of eyes on operations, across both of our producing basins in the Southeast and the Northwest.
And it seems like, EPA, Environmental Defense Fund, I don't know if it's because they're already set up to have flyovers and this, obviously the methane sat, but or have the funding to do that. But it seems like a lot of the investigations or the issues kind of start with that being identified that way, and then is handed over to the state to kind of research. Is that a fair way to see how that progresses?
I could see why that's the perspective coming in from the outside. I will say this year, our largest enforcement action taken under our race rule was in fact taken based on self-reported data from operators.
Okay.
We got the data in, we took a look at it, and in calendar year 2022, we determined that 30% of the reported venting and flaring was coming from 20 sites.
Wow.
And so now there are permissible reasons to flare, but other things like that, but it caused us to dig in. And we took some enforcement action against the top 12. And the reason why I say the top 12 is the top 2 were actually flaring for reasons related to H2S concentrations in the gas and lack of sour gas takeaway capacity. But the others, as we started looking at it, couldn't be justified by a permissible basis. So our largest enforcement to date under the waste rule was actually self-initiated by data that we were requiring to be collected. We've taken some enforcement action based on reports that are coming in from these third-party systems. But some of those have identified permissible flaring events, right? They were reported or they were due to an equipment failure. So again, it was something we would expect to see. And so we were able to address those relatively quickly. So that's my perspective on it. It is something we review, but it's not the only data point. It's certainly not the only data point we review, but it is something we're paying attention to because obviously some of our external stakeholders, sort of non-industry stakeholders, are looking at it and sort of holding us to account for those questions.
And I think there's, and probably the reason for my question is that I see emails like a helicopter's flying over or planes flying over. So everyone's very paranoid about what's watching. So I think that probably is what kind of guides my question, whether rightly or wrongly. So and back on the data and self-reporting, it's kind of a damned if do, damned if don't, because you need to obviously file. They're required to file, but then they file, then they kind of get, quote, caught for bad performance. So it's kind of, obviously the answer is do it right and then record it right, and then it's all right. But there's obviously historically that's not going to be the case. So everyone's going to be kind of set up for issues.
I guess I understand that perspective. I probably wouldn't necessarily describe it in that way. I think we have a system. Obviously, operators are the most familiar with their operations. They've got the data coming in real time. They've got the information coming in real time that they can report to us, and they have the most knowledge of sort of the basis for it. And so I think that while it may feel like a gotcha as you did it, in the instances where we took enforcement action and violations were admitted and acknowledged and recognized, it was circumstances that were driven by kind of conscious decisions to not take the steps contemplated by the rule. And so by the rules, we've tried to be transparent in both directions. We take pride in working through violations through sort of informal resolution and kind of, where appropriate, giving credit, for responsive actions. But again, I think in a transparent environment, we're very clear about the requirements. That's where we're landing.
Yeah. Well, and like in April, there was a newspaper article talking about 6 oil companies being fined, but from what I saw, a lot of them had been venting or flaring for many, many days, like hundreds of days, and it's a lot of gas. So it's kind of goes beyond best practices to let that happen. So there is, at some point, if you're not doing it right, then you have consequences.
I had an entity that was trying to say, well, we've had a lot of emergencies and upsets, and my response was, for 220 days in a calendar year. I mean, that again, we're looking at circumstances where the number of days and other things like that can't be explained by other causes, and so I think yes, there's kind of a gotcha. You can will review your data and goes, but I would add, with all the real-time monitoring that's occurring, particularly at high volume operations and other things like that, that accurate reporting is a reasonable expectation, and I think readily in reach for most operators. Certainly for the lion's share of the gas volumes we're talking about.
Yep. No, I think you're right on that. It's so y'all started with a baseline kind of capture rate about 2 years ago, and with the goal of having it down to 90, or I guess up to 98% within the next couple of years. How is that kind of going as far as are you seeing it improve or?
I am seeing it improve. We've got some reporting holes still, although that's closing up. I think the last time I checked, while we have a high number of operators who are not reporting at this moment, the proportion of gas, the total produced gas that they represent is minuscule. I mean, it's, under, it's at the 1 or 2% level, not a teeny volume given our overall production volumes, but the vast majority is reporting. I think we are seeing progress. We've still got some questions about operations that we're working with operators on. I hope to have the results of some early audit processes relayed out available shortly so that we can talk with, sort of share some lessons learned and issues. But I would say on net, we're seeing performance that we would expect on sort of an operator and basin basis. For example, up in the San Juan, which is a predominantly dry gas play, you see by nature fairly high gas capture percentages out of the gates. They've got their gas wells and they've got excess takeaway capacity that's there. In the Permian, in some parts of it, they're building pipelines sort of as fast as they get filled up for takeaway. And so you're looking at a different challenge. We're supporting operators that are deploying kind of novel solutions to some of these challenges. So, we did a year and a half ago, a closed loop gas capture pilot that's now expanded to more operators. I believe, if I recall correctly, EOGs was the first. And so, we are looking at, supporting the deployment of more solutions like that, again, with the overall goal of getting more of the gas to market, which has value to the state, and also reducing its emission to the atmosphere, whether that's sort of direct venting or flaring. We're focused on the minimization of both.
Well, talking about solutions like that, there's been a lot of talk of Inflation Reduction Act and the amount of money for methane reduction. And I guess they just announced they're going to start providing or allowing states to kind of bid on getting some of that money. Is that something that your division is going to be focused on, or?
So my division is currently in the process. We've had a long-standing plugging program, right? So everyone's familiar with the bipartisan infrastructure law. I think as we look at it, we've got about $92 million coming under that program, and probably will match it with another $50 million in state funds by virtue of what's in our existing oil rec fund. So we're deploying that quite successfully to address orphan wells on state and private land across New Mexico. We are looking at the methane emission reduction program, sort of phase 1 grant, which, as I understand it, will provide an opportunity to us to both either enhance our methane detection and monitoring, and or provide some incentive programs to look at plugging marginal wells, so ones that haven't necessarily been orphaned, that haven't been orphaned by operators, that are still reporting production. Obviously, like most oil producing states, New Mexico has its own definition of that category of wells. We are going to be submitting an application for that funding, and I think New Mexico's share, if you're looking at it on a formula basis, would be about $11 million. Until we get the funding and sort of see the terms of the grant, we haven't made a sort of firm decision about how we're going to deploy those dollars, in sort of what order and what priority. I mean, I would anticipate if we're deploying that funding, it's going to be a similar focus to our approach on orphan wells. So obviously high, methane emission rates, high leak rates, or, significant concerns about well condition are going to be drivers about what gets plugged first. So is proximity to sensitive receptors, whether it's, proximities to occupied dwellings, schools, facilities, or, proximity to sensitive, kind of ecological features will be another driver. We have sort of a priority list we work through when we're making decisions about what orphan wells to plug. I mean, with the caveat that we have to have a plugging order in place first, but that's sort of how we're thinking about it. So we are looking to deploy that funding. It's a little early to say exactly how, but we see an opportunity again to grab some emissions reduction. I will say, at least in New Mexico's case, and we are the first state with the BIL funding to measure methane both pre and post. We have seen a handful of super emitters, but generally speaking, the emissions from our wells, and they're not new by any stretch, but our wells have been relatively low. But I would say most of our wells have sort of some level of surface infrastructure that has been abandoned in place, but is intact on the surface. So, that has, those types of emissions has not been a huge driver for us in prioritization. It's been more of those other factors.
But with so many legacy type wells that exist in New Mexico, up on the Central Basin, well, all over the place, it seems like they're going to get less economical viable, so they either need to be plugged, but if they're not plugged, then the economics of those wells are such that they probably can't afford better thief hatches, better flares, all that type of equipment. So how does that, and especially a lot of the owners of those type of wells they're not going to be the large independents or the majors. So it's companies that don't have probably the capability. So how does New Mexico work with those type of companies on that kind of that marginal well, independent producer type?
I think our rules have put in place sort of considerations for those sorts of situations. Both ours and NMEDs sort of took the approach to address those, recognizing they weren't a unique case. I don't have the numbers handy, but as I recall, still, even though, yes, there are a large number of marginal wells held by smaller operators and other pieces, we still have a fairly large number of wells that I would consider marginal that are actually held by pretty significant producers.
Okay.
Kind of writ large. If you look at the count on a well by well basis, I get that the economics are challenging. I mean, I think on the OCD side, because we are not establishing prescriptive standards, and there's obviously opportunities to deduct sort of beneficial use as you figure out your gas capture percentage. And we're just looking at an overall performance standard, in addition to the measures that are specific to those wells in our rules. You provide more opportunities for them to kind of meet it in a way that's meet our rules in a way that's most cost effective for those operators. Because again, we're not looking at, you've got to get 98% gas capture from each and every site. You got to get 98% gas capture sort of across your portfolio. And so we think that is an advantage of the performance standard that we put in place.
Now, the danger or the challenge with that type of provision, and we're kind of seeing it with the methane tax, the 0.2%, is that these larger companies have a much larger denominator. Mm-hmm. And so they're able to kind of avoid that tax or that hurdle, where it's those mid-sized, smaller companies that don't have the large denominator, so they tend to get hit by the hurdles.
I mean, what I can say at least is what I'm seeing on the ground. I've not had operators coming in to me and say, you know what? So earlier in February of this year, we established either an operator's baseline. So the operators were either at 98%, and then they don't have any improvement to do. They just have to stay at 98% every year going forward. Or they were below 98%, and the rule calculates sort of an improvement path to get you to 98% by the end of 2026. And it's a formula set out in the rules. I've not had operators come in and talk to me that those pathways or those timelines were unachievable. So, you know, I think I appreciate the concern, but I think we really did spend a fair amount of time in the map, or my predecessor spent a fair amount of time in the map process and the rulemaking process to sort of flush out these issues and I think get the balance correct. And so I think that's why we are not seeing, at least at this juncture, operators coming in and saying, you know what, we can't do that. And I would say the flaring issues and the enforcement cases that we've taken have actually really been against higher volume facilities that were operating in front of the takeaway capacity that they needed to do it. Maybe they weren't getting the contractual commitments from their midstream operator, but the rule, I mean, you know, your midstream not meeting their contractual obligation is an operator midstream problem, not an OCD problem, because that's not an emergency interruption. That's them not filling their end of the bargain. Where actually the most troubling issues we were seeing on the flaring side and venting side was actually at newer, larger capacity facilities that were being run candidly ahead of the takeaway, which is inconsistent with the rule framework we set up, which is candidly why we took action against those sites.
And I think we see that on the Texas side of the Permian also, that the lack of midstream takeaway basically it doesn't force the operator to flare because they know the takeaway, but that clearly fits into their decision and whether they go ahead and drill the well and produce the well, whether they have the takeaway or not, that's kind of up to them, it seems like.
Well, I mean, it is up to them. And I understand on the business side of the ledgers, particularly as a well in the Permian, you know, the oil is the product you're after and the gas is sort of it is a marketable product that has value to the state, but it is from the operator's perspective, candidly, just a cost. I mean, it's a problem to deal with as opposed to the, resource they're pursuing.
So speaking of flares, I know there were requirements that for 2021 and flares put in before that there were requirements to make flares either be able to have continuous igniters or be able to have some type of SCADA system in to let people know that if it's down. What are the requirements for flares? And that was kind of for 2021. I probably missed it, but anything since then?
We have not changed the substantive requirements. We did, there was sort of an affirmative obligation of sort of a retrofit point. What we set up was basically kind of a voluntary certification form where an operator could tell us that, they've completed any required retrofit based on the, size, based on the requirements of the rule. We got a response rate that candidly on that one was a little lower than I would anticipate, based on what we think the prevalence of flares are in the field, even if you're just looking at, the number of large central tank batteries and other things like that you would expect to have an associated flare. We opted for a certification approach to provide kind of a, quick and dirty check for us up front. It is something that my inspectors in the field are charged with looking at as they're conducting their inspections. And it would be something we'd be looking at for a compliance action if one is reported up being out of compliance or not an issue. To date, we've not taken a compliance action related to failure to retrofit a flare, and obviously not submitting the certification was not a per se formal rule requirement. It was more a tool for us to track sort of where we were, how do we look at it, and based on the response rate, that's when we made the decision, all right, this is something we're going to look at. That'll just be added to the list of things our inspectors do when they're out in the field.
And when they're looking, are they looking for those components of the continuous
Yes.
igniter, some type of a SCADA or communication system, those type of
things?
Yeah,
I mean, they're looking for the base requirements. Obviously, there's some cross-checking back because as I recall that provision of the rule, there were some different standards depending on the size of of the facility. So
Yes.
it may be in the field, they may or may not have that information handy depending on how strong their cell signal is and how connected it is. So they may be
I think it was like 60 MCF and
yeah,
below is one and above is another.
that
Something like
sounds right.
that. Okay. Well, I appreciate your time. One last question or topic is leak detection monitoring, LDAR. Obviously, there was a time where it was like every 6 months, kind of per quad OA. It seems like that has become more frequent or required more frequent, and you're adding, or generally AVO is being added, continuous monitoring is being added. Kind of what's your sense as to how that leak detection monitoring and continuous monitoring is going to evolve in New Mexico?
To me, that's an important pillar of our rule framework, right? If our goal is to minimize waste and minimize venting and flaring, it's both, you know, addressing sort of the routine venting and flaring, right, which we banned except subject to sort of certain condition, and also addressing leaks as they occur in the field. And I think more frequent visits are better. I mean, the examples I can think of that I alluded to where we took action against an operator based on plume data that we observed on NASA or someone shared with us that they picked up from NASA were instances of leaks, significant leaks in the field due to equipment failures. That actually wasn't impermissible. What was impermissible is they forgot to report. I would say the good news out of those examples is that generally speaking, the leaks were caught. So I'm going to attribute that at least in part to more frequent monitoring of your sites, more frequent visiting. So I think the increasing cadence of those types of things are ways to get at, frankly, leaks you can't control that I understand to happen, you know, right? Valves are going to fail. You know, there was a, you know, spill last year that was relatively significant. It was, I think it was in secondary containment entirely, but a lightning hit a tank, right? And, you know, I mean, so, you know, we understand that we understand that challenges happen in there. I think by getting at the leak frequency, using alarm, you know, or using, you know, novel kind of approved alarm technologies allows you to identify those faster. And so I was actually a little relieved that when we took enforcement against those couple of operators for the leaks, the story was not, oh, this valve failed and it's been leaking for months. It's like the valve failed. It did leak at that time frame. It was part of our inspection rubric. We had it replaced within a day, and we forgot to report, which is a separate sort of violation basis, but it does mean I think those types of leak detection are having their intended effect.
You know, we do quite a few LDARs every 6 months, and we see thief hatches and non-working combustors, flares. It's kind of that 80-20 rule where there are leaking valves, but a lot of those are so minor.
Yep.
But it's really the thief hatches and the flares that seem to really generate the continuous amount of gas from a company.
And I will say this on the leak deflection front, another tool that we will be deploying this year is OCD purchased its first 4 FLIR cameras. And we've trained 6 to 8 of we'll have trained by the end of the year, 6 to 8 of our 16 inspectors. And those will be another tool we deploy in the field as part of our, you know, inspection toolkit. And we'll be looking to add some more of those cameras, you know, as budget allows. Obviously, it's not, I mean, as, you know, overseeing an entity that has the ability to sort of subpoena data and other things like that. You know, we have other means to access the information, but again, we view it as a important tool, and having properly trained operators was a key component of that.
Well, and having the data is fantastic, but there's, like you mentioned, a lag associated with that where the camera is going to be more real time.
Right.
And you can identify it right then. So it's well, good. Well, Director Fuge, I've really appreciate your time and your input. I think this is very helpful for operators to really understand kind of where you're coming from, and appreciate the time. I don't want to take up too much more, but if you have any closing comments, great. Otherwise, thank you for the time.
Grant, it's been a pleasure talking with you. Looking forward to talking with you again. I think as the operators, who are familiar with New Mexico know, I mean, we are focused on ensuring responsible development, but are also willing to have kind of pragmatic discussions with them about issues and kind of working through them in a way that meets our, broad statutory obligations. So thank you for the time this afternoon. I'll talk to you again.